At 68 years old, Eleanor Hawthorne sat in a leather chair that cost more than her first car and listened to a stranger in a gray suit explain that her entire life had been worth nothing. Not almost nothing, not close to nothing, nothing. The attorney's voice was careful, measured the way people speak when they know the words they're about to say will land like bullets. He read from the document in front of him with the practiced detachment of a man who had delivered bad news professionally for decades, and Eleanor sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her white hair styled the way Walter had always preferred, and she absorbed every single word the way stone absorbs rain, slowly, completely, without any visible sign that it was happening at all. But we need to go back before we go forward. Because what happened in that conference room on a Tuesday morning in March cannot be understood without understanding the 40 years that led to it. And what happened after that conference room, what Eleanor Hawthorne found when a rusty iron key turned in an oak door's lock in a town nobody had ever heard of, well, that changes everything you think you know about love, about loyalty, and about the quiet, devastating patience of a man who spent 4 decades building a fortress disguised as a forgotten house. If you have ever been underestimated because of your age, if you have ever been discarded by the very people who should have valued you most, if you have ever sat in silence while someone explained to you that your decades of devotion amounted to nothing more than adequate compensation for services rendered, then this story is yours. Stay until the end, because divine justice, as it turns out, never gets the address wrong. Eleanor Ann Calloway had been 28 years old in 1984 when she married Walter Hawthorne. She'd been working as his legal secretary for just over a year, the kind of efficient, organized, invisible woman who kept an entire law office running without ever needing credit for it. She typed briefs at 70 words per minute. She managed his calendar with surgical precision. She answered the phone with a voice that made anxious clients feel immediately calmer, and she did all of it for $14 an hour in a small office on the fourth floor of a building in downtown Boston that smelled permanently of old paper and fresh coffee. Walter was 45, a senior partner at one of Boston's most respected law firms. Tall silver at the temples, even then, with the kind of commanding presence that made courtrooms fall silent when he stood to speak. He wore hand-tailored suits and Italian shoes and a watch that cost more than Eleanor earned in 6 months. He was brilliant, respected, wealthy, and recently divorced from a woman named Patricia, who had left him for a younger surgeon and taken with her every ounce of his willingness to appear vulnerable in public. When Walter asked Eleanor to dinner 6 months into her employment, she had been stunned. When he proposed 6 months after that, she said yes immediately because she believed she had found something rare and precious. Security and love in one package. A man who needed her. A life that would finally feel permanent. She had no way of knowing that she was walking into a war that had already been declared without her knowledge. Walter's 3 children from his first marriage made their position clear on the wedding day itself. Preston was 20 years old, a junior at Dartmouth, handsome and arrogant in the way that only the sons of wealthy men can be. He shook Eleanor's hand at the reception with a grip that was just slightly too firm, looked her directly in the eyes and said, "Congratulations," with a tone that made the words sound like a threat. Cordelia was 18, freshly graduated from a private academy in Connecticut, already wearing the sharp social armor of a young woman who had learned to wield cruelty with a smile. She was beautiful in a cold architectural, all cheekbones and careful posture and eyes that assessed everyone they looked at for potential usefulness or threat. Bennett was 16, still growing into his height, quieter than his siblings, but carrying the same resentment in his slouched shoulders and his refusal to make eye contact with the woman his father had just married. To all 3 of them, Eleanor was the secretary, the younger woman, the outsider who had somehow tricked her way into their family and would now share in resources they considered exclusively theirs. She was not their mother. She would never be their mother. And they would spend the next 4 decades making absolutely certain she never forgot it. Cordelia delivered the defining statement of Eleanor's married life at the wedding reception, standing beside the champagne fountain in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than Eleanor's entire wardrobe. Her voice was sweet. Her eyes were frozen. "You will never be our mother. Do not even try." But Eleanor had tried anyway. For 40 years, she tried with the kind of stubborn, hopeful persistence that only people who desperately want to be loved can sustain. She remembered every birthday. She attended every graduation, sitting in the back row, so as not to cause discomfort. She sent thoughtful gifts for every occasion, gifts that were never acknowledged and almost certainly never opened. She hosted holidays at the Brookline Mansion, cooking elaborate meals for people who ate her food without thanking her and left without saying goodbye. She kept their childhood bedrooms exactly as they had left them, shrines to people who visited as rarely as possible and complained about everything when they did. She bit her tongue through cutting remarks about her background, her lack of education beyond community college, her failure to produce children of her own, her clothes, her cooking, her voice, her presence, her existence. And through all of it, through every holiday dinner where she sat at the end of the table while the real family talked over her, through every family photograph she was asked to step out of, through every Christmas morning when her gifts sat unopened, while the children tore into presents from their biological mother, Eleanor, built what she genuinely, desperately believed was a real marriage. The Brookline Mansion was a colonial house that Walter had owned long before meeting her. 6 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a formal dining room, a library, a sun porch overlooking manicured gardens. Eleanor managed all of it. She supervised the cleaning service, coordinated repairs, maintained the grounds, planned dinner parties for Walter's colleagues and clients. She played the gracious hostess who made everyone comfortable and never drew too much attention to herself, the woman who kept everything running perfectly while remaining essentially invisible. She was very, very good at being invisible. 40 years of practice will do that. Walter had been kind to her in his way. He provided well. He made sure she had appropriate clothes for social events. He never raised his voice or his hand. He told her she looked lovely before every dinner party and thanked her afterward for being such a wonderful hostess. Small kindnesses. Genuine, she believed, but always measured, always controlled, always with a slight distance that she could never quite close. But there were walls. There were always walls. His home office was strictly off limits. A heavy oak door with the lock that Eleanor never received a key to. "I need one space that is just mine, Peggy. Surely you can understand that." He called her Peggy, sometimes a private nickname that nobody else used. And when he said it, his voice softened in a way that made her believe he truly loved her, even when everything else suggested she was simply a well-maintained piece of domestic infrastructure. He kept separate bank accounts that Eleanor never saw statements for. When she asked about their finances once early in the marriage, maybe the second or third year, Walter had smiled and patted her hand the way you might pat a child who has asked a question that is endearing in its naivety. "Do not worry your pretty head about money, darling. That is my job. Your job is to make this house a home, and you do it perfectly." So Eleanor had not worried. She trusted completely the way you trust someone when you have built your entire identity around being their wife. She had no career to fall back on, no savings of her own, no family left. Her parents had died years apart, her father from a heart attack at 62, her mother from cancer 3 years later. She had been an only child, and 40 years of being Walter's wife had meant gradually, almost imperceptibly, losing touch with the few friends she had made before marriage. She existed entirely within the orbit of Walter Hawthorne. He was the sun. She was whatever word you use for the thing that circles the sun and never generates any light of its own. Even when Walter started taking weekend trips alone once a month, and sometimes more, telling Eleanor he needed time to decompress at a property he had inherited from a relative, she had not questioned it. She packed his overnight bag the way she always did. Dress shirts folded, precisely toiletries in the leather case she had given him for their 10th anniversary. She kissed him goodbye at the front door. She watched his car disappear down the driveway, and she trusted. That trust, she would learn far too late, had been the most important thing she ever gave him. Not because it was misplaced, but because Walter Hawthorne needed her to trust blindly in order to protect her from the very people sitting across from her in that conference room 40 years later. But she did not know that yet. She would not know that for a very long time. Walter Hawthorne died on a Tuesday morning in March of 2024, 3 months shy of what would have been his 85th birthday. Eleanor found him when she brought his morning coffee, a ritual they had maintained for 40 years, without a single interruption. Her bringing him coffee in bed at 7 a.m. sharp, 2 sugars, a splash of cream, in the blue ceramic mug he preferred. He was lying on his back, his hands folded across his chest, as if he had arranged himself carefully before departing. His face was peaceful. The doctor would later confirm a massive heart attack, instantaneous, no suffering. He had gone to sleep and simply not woken up, which is the kind of death that people call a blessing when it happens to someone they love, and a convenience when it happens to someone whose assets they are eager to distribute. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the master bedroom, holding that blue mug's steam still rising from the surface, and she felt something she did not expect. Beneath the shock, beneath the sudden hollow feeling of standing in a room with a body that used to be a person, there was something that felt almost like the world holding its breath, as if the house itself was waiting for what came next. The funeral was enormous. Walter had been one of Boston's most prominent attorneys for over 50 years, and it seemed like half the city came to pay their respects. Hundreds of people filled the church, a sea of dark suits and careful grief. Colleagues who had argued cases alongside him. Former clients who credited him with saving their businesses, their families, their freedom. Judges who had respected his legal mind. Prominent families who had relied on his discretion. Preston, Cordelia, and Bennett sat in the front row with their spouses and children, presenting the image of a united grieving family. They wore designer black. They held hands. They dabbed at their eyes at the appropriate moments. They placed Eleanor in the second row. For space, Preston had explained with a tight professional smile that did not reach his eyes. In case you have family members who need to sit with you. Eleanor had no family members. Preston knew this. Everyone knew this. The second row was exactly what it was. A public declaration that she was not quite family, not quite worthy of standing with blood relations in their performance of grief. During the service, colleague after colleague stood at the podium to eulogize Walter Hawthorne, the brilliant legal strategist, the devoted father, the pillar of the Boston community, the man who had shaped an entire generation of young attorneys, the philanthropist, the mentor, the friend. Not one person mentioned Walter Hawthorne, the husband. Not one person acknowledged the woman who had stood beside him, supported him, managed his home and his social life and his daily existence for 4 decades. As far as the eulogies were concerned, Eleanor Hawthorne did not exist. At the reception afterward held at Preston's expensive home in Newton, Eleanor overheard Cordelia talking to a group of her friends near the bar. Cordelia was 58 years old now. 3 divorces behind her, still beautiful in that cold architectural way, still wielding cruelty like a precision instrument. It is just so difficult, Cordelia was saying, pressing a tissue to eyes that Eleanor noticed were completely dry. Losing Daddy, at least we have each other, the real family, to get through this together. The real family. As if Eleanor had been playing pretend for 40 years. The reading of the will was scheduled for exactly 1 week after the funeral. It was held in the downtown Boston offices of Robert Kessler, the attorney who had handled Walter's estate planning for the past 20 years. Eleanor dressed carefully that morning, simple black dress, pearl earrings Walter had given her for their 25th anniversary. White hair styled in the elegant twist he had always complimented. She drove downtown in her 10-year-old Honda Civic hands, trembling slightly on the steering wheel, telling herself there was no reason to be nervous. 40 years of marriage. Surely Walter had provided for her. Surely after 4 decades of devotion and service and love, she would be taken care of. The thought that it could be otherwise simply did not occur to her. It was too enormous, too unthinkable, like imagining that gravity might suddenly reverse. Preston, Cordelia, and Bennett arrived together in separate expensive cars, each one trailing an expensive attorney like a shadow. They greeted Eleanor with the careful, rehearsed politeness of people who have already won and are simply waiting for the formality to confirm it. They arranged themselves on one side of the long conference table, a united front of tailored suits in confident postures facing Eleanor. Sitting alone on the other side, Robert Kessler began with the standard legal formalities: testamentary capacity, proper execution, witnesses, the mechanical language of law that precedes the human devastation it so often delivers. Then he got to the specifics. He read in the careful, deliberate monotone that attorneys use when they know the words they are about to say will change someone's life forever, and they would rather be anywhere else on earth than in this room. The estate of Walter Raymond Hawthorne is valued at approximately $8.7 million. This includes the primary residence in Brookline, currently valued at $2.1 million. Investment and retirement accounts totaling approximately $6 million, and various other personal assets and holdings. Eleanor felt her shoulders relax slightly. $8.7 million. More than enough. Walter had been wise to keep the finances private, growing and protecting their future. She would be secure. She would be fine. The Brookline residence. Robert continued, and his voice shifted into something even more careful, more measured, like a man walking across ice, is left in its entirety to Walter's children from his first marriage. Preston Hawthorne, Cordelia Hawthorne, Sinclair and Bennett Hawthorne. To be divided equally among them or sold with proceeds split 3 ways as they determine appropriate. Cold fear began spreading through Eleanor's chest. The house. The house where she had lived for 40 years. Her gardens, her kitchen. The rooms she had maintained like a museum of a marriage. The investment accounts totaling approximately $4.2 million are similarly to be divided equally among Preston, Cordelia, and Bennett Hawthorne. The retirement accounts valued at approximately $1.8 million. Same distribution. 3 equal shares to the 3 children. Eleanor's voice came out barely above a whisper. Robert, what about me? What did Walter leave for me? Robert Kessler looked at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. It was the face of a man who was about to do something he found personally repugnant because his professional obligations required it. Genuine pain. Genuine shame. I am getting to your specific bequest now, Eleanor. I have to tell you, I argued against the language Walter used. Strenuously, but he insisted on every word. I am very sorry. He took a visible breath and read from the document. My wife, Eleanor Ann Hawthorne, has lived comfortably at my expense for 40 years and has wanted for nothing during the course of our marriage. She has had the benefit of my wealth, my home, my social standing, and a lifestyle far beyond what she could have achieved on her own working as a secretary. This is more than adequate compensation for her companionship and for the domestic services she has provided over the years. Each word landed like a physical blow. Companionship, domestic services, 40 years of love and sacrifice and devotion and loneliness and hope reduced to the language of an employment contract being terminated. Across the table, Preston was smiling openly now. Cordelia examined her manicured nails with studied indifference. Bennett had his phone out and was texting someone already planning how to spend his share. Robert continued, his voice heavy with something that sounded very close to grief. The will further states, while I have appreciated Eleanor's presence in my home and her efficient management of domestic affairs, I believe my primary obligation and responsibility is to my children and my bloodline. They are my true legacy, the continuation of the Hawthorne family name. Therefore, I leave to Eleanor Ann Hawthorne only the following. 1 property I own located at 31 Winding Creek Road in the town of Cedarwood, Massachusetts, along with all contents contained therein. This property is given to Eleanor with the express understanding that she will vacate the Brookline residence within 30 days of my death, as that property is needed by my rightful heirs. Silence, absolute silence. The kind of silence that has weight and texture and fills a room like water filling a sinking ship. Cordelia broke it first, her voice dripping with the kind of sympathy that is actually contempt wearing a disguise. Daddy mentioned that Cedarwood property years ago. Some falling apart old house in the middle of nowhere he inherited from some uncle. Not even worth the property taxes. But at least you will have a roof over your head, Eleanor. That is something. Robert slid a brown envelope across the polished table. His hand trembled. Inside was a rusty iron key, old and heavy, the kind that looked like it belonged in another century, and a single sheet of Walter's expensive stationery covered in his familiar, precise handwriting. 31 Winding Creek Road, Cedarwood, Massachusetts. Eleanor, this is yours now. Go there as soon as you can. You will understand everything once you arrive. I am sorry I could not tell you before, but they were always watching, always listening, always looking for ways to challenge anything I tried to do. Trust me one last time, my darling. All my love, always. Walter. Trust me one last time. After publicly declaring her nothing more than adequately compensated domestic help, after leaving her essentially destitute, after 40 years, Eleanor stood on legs that did not feel entirely connected to her body. She picked up the brown envelope and walked toward the door without looking at Preston, Cordelia, or Bennett. Without saying a word, Eleanor Robert called after her. If you need anything, anything at all, Please call me, I mean that. She nodded without turning around. She made it to her car in the parking garage before she broke. Sitting in the driver's seat of her 10-year-old Honda Civic, hands gripping the steering wheel, until her knuckles turned white and she cried. Not gentle, dignified tears. The ugly, gasping body, shaking kind of crying, that comes when you realize that the life you thought you were living was a story someone else was telling, and they have just reached the final page. The 30 days that followed were a masterclass in calculated cruelty delivered by people who had refined entitlement into a performing art. Preston, Cordelia, and Bennett came to the Brookline house nearly every day, bringing contractors, interior designers, real estate agents. They walked through rooms with measuring tapes and color swatches, while Eleanor was still living there, still sleeping in the master bedroom, still drinking her morning coffee in the kitchen. They discussed knocking down walls, ripping out cabinets, modernizing the gardens Eleanor had spent decades cultivating. They never asked her to leave rooms. They simply acted as if she were not there. A ghost who had not yet realized she was dead, still haunting rooms that had already been reassigned to the living. One morning, Eleanor was drinking coffee at the kitchen table when Cordelia walked through with an interior designer, gesturing broadly at walls that held 40 years of Eleanor's carefully chosen photographs. We will definitely open up this whole space. Knock out this wall entirely, create a massive open concept kitchen living area. That is what buyers want now. Another afternoon, a real estate agent toured the house while Eleanor sat reading in the living room. The agent and Preston stood perhaps 3 feet from her chair, discussing staging strategies and comparable sales as if she were a piece of furniture that happened to have come with the house. The gardens are significantly overgrown, the agent noted, looking through the window at the beds Eleanor had planted and maintained for 40 years. Every rosebush chosen with care, every perennial placed with intention. We will need professional landscaping crews to clean all of that up before listing. Those were Eleanor's gardens, her hands, her work, her only authentic creation in 40 years of living someone else's life. Now they were just overgrown obstacles to a profitable sale. The nights were worst. Eleanor would lie awake calculating her future with the cold precision of someone tallying the days until a terminal diagnosis. She was 68 years old. No job, no career, no work experience since 1984, no savings, no family. The Cedarwood property was almost certainly worthless, exactly as Cordelia had described. Maybe she could sell it for $50,000 or $60,000 if she was lucky. That might sustain her for 3 or 4 years of extremely frugal living. And then what? 72 years old and destitute, dependent on charity, living in subsidized housing for the elderly poor. Some nights the fear was so overwhelming it became physical. Her heart racing, her chest tightening, her breath coming in shallow gasps, while she paced the master bedroom in the dark and her mind painted vivid, detailed pictures of destitution and despair. Other nights, the fear transformed into a rage so fierce it frightened her. How dare Walter do this? How dare he let her spend 40 years thinking they were partners? How dare he choose his entitled, contemptuous children over the woman who gave him every single day of her adult life? But rage requires energy, and Eleanor was running out. Maintaining anger is exhausting when you are simultaneously terrified. So mostly she felt numb, going through the mechanical motions of packing up a life that had turned out to be built on foundations she never knew were sand. 3 suitcases of clothes, 2 boxes of truly personal items, photographs of her parents, letters her mother had written, a few books that had belonged to her grandmother. That was everything. 40 years compressed into what could fit in the trunk of a Honda Civic. On day 26, Eleanor was standing at the kitchen sink when she overheard Preston and Cordelia talking in the dining room. They either did not know she could hear them or did not care. Both options were equally cruel. I honestly cannot believe Father left her anything at all, Cordelia said. That Cedarwood property is probably worth $50,000 at most. He should have left her absolutely nothing. He felt guilty, Preston replied. 40 years is a long time to string someone along, even if she was essentially just the help. The Cedarwood place was his way of easing his conscience without reducing what we received. Well, she should be grateful we are being so civilized about this transition, Cordelia said. Most women her age with no skills and no family would end up in subsidized housing. At least she can sell that dump and have a little nest egg for a few years. They laughed together, the casual, easy laughter of people who have never been afraid of anything. Eleanor stood at the sink, gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles went white. 40 years of conditioning told her to stay silent, to absorb the blow, to be the gracious woman who never made scenes. The conditioning held, even now, even after losing everything. On her final night in the house, Eleanor could not sleep. She wandered through the master bedroom one last time, pulling open drawers that were already mostly empty, and behind the heavy walnut dresser, wedged into the narrow gap between wood and wall, where it must have fallen months or even years ago, she found a photograph. It was a picture of her sleeping, taken from close range clearly by Walter, clearly without her knowledge. She was lying on her side, one hand tucked under her cheek, her face soft and unguarded in a way it never was when she was awake. The afternoon light was catching her hair and turning it gold. On the back, in Walter's precise handwriting, 4 words: "The only real thing in my life." Eleanor stared at those words for a very long time. She did not understand them. They did not match anything she thought she knew about her marriage or her husband or the will that had just erased her from his legacy. They were a contradiction, a puzzle piece from a different box entirely. But they were enough, enough to make her decide that she would drive to Cedarwood tomorrow instead of calling a realtor to sell a house she had never seen. Enough to make her pick up that rusty iron key one more time and choose to trust a dead man's words over a living world that had given her every reason not to. On her final morning in the Brookline house, Eleanor loaded her car. 3 suitcases, 2 boxes, the wedding photograph she took from the mantel despite Preston's protest that it was technically house property. Preston arrived at 1:30 early, clearly wanting to ensure she left on schedule. "The movers will be here at 2, he said without meeting her eyes. "I will supervise everything." Eleanor heard herself speak. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that surprised even her. "Preston, do you have any idea what it is like to give someone 40 years of your life and be told it meant nothing?" His face flushed red. "Father left you a property. You are not getting nothing." "Your father left me a mystery," Eleanor said. "A house I have never seen in a town I have never heard of. You and your siblings received millions of dollars and this mansion and the satisfaction of knowing your father called you his true legacy. I received a rusty key and 30 days to disappear." She got in her car before he could respond. The brown envelope sat on the passenger seat. The GPS showed 2 hours and 22 minutes to Cedarwood, Massachusetts. 2 hours and 22 minutes to a completely unknown future. Eleanor started the engine and drove away from Brookline, from the mansion, from the gardens, from 40 years of a life she had thought she was living. And as she drove west through Massachusetts past suburbs that gave way to small towns, that gave way to forest, Eleanor Hawthorne made herself a single promise. Whatever she found at 31 Winding Creek Road, shelter or ruin value or emptiness, she would survive it. She was 68 years old with nothing left to lose except her dignity. And she would be damned if she would lose that too. Because sometimes she was beginning to understand having absolutely nothing left to lose becomes its own peculiar kind of freedom. Cedarwood, Massachusetts turned out to be exactly as small and remote as Cordelia had implied, though perhaps not as forgotten. The main street consisted of maybe 15 buildings clustered around a modest town square that looked like it had been frozen in time somewhere around 1955 and had simply decided to stay there. A general store with a faded green awning, a diner with checkered curtains and a handwritten specials board in the window. A tiny post office built from the same gray stone as everything else in town. A gas station with 2 pumps and a mechanic's bay that was currently occupied by a truck that had probably been old when Eleanor was young. A white church with a modest steeple and a sign out front that read "All are welcome" and appeared to mean it. A library that looked like it had been built when Abraham Lincoln was still practicing law. As Eleanor drove slowly down Main Street, her Honda Civic conspicuous among the pickup trucks and older sedans, she noticed something strange. People stopped what they were doing to watch her pass. Not with hostility, not with a suspicious squint of small-town residents assessing an outsider, with something else entirely, something that looked remarkably like recognition. An elderly man sweeping the sidewalk in front of the general store paused mid-stroke and lifted his hand in a slow, deliberate wave. A woman arranging flowers outside the diner turned to watch. nodding once a small, private confirmation of something Eleanor could not begin to guess at. Even a group of teenagers outside the library looked up from their phones with genuine interest rather than the usual adolescent indifference. They were expecting her. Eleanor did not know this yet, but she felt it, the way you can feel a storm approaching before the first drop of rain. Her GPS directed her off Main Street onto Winding Creek Road, which began as regular pavement and transitioned within 200 yards into a dirt road that led into increasingly dense forest. Ancient oak trees lined both sides, their trunks so massive they had to be hundreds of years old, their spreading branches creating a cathedral of green shade that filtered the afternoon sunlight into shifting patterns across her windshield. The road was rough, rutted with old tire tracks. Eleanor drove slowly, carefully, her sedan bouncing over roots and ruts, while the forest closed around her like curtains drawing shut on everything she had ever known. After about a mile, her GPS announced with mechanical cheerfulness, "You have arrived at your destination." Eleanor stopped the car. She sat for a long moment with her hands on the steering wheel, afraid to look up, afraid of what she might see, afraid that Cordelia had been right and she would find nothing but a collapsing shell of a house standing in weeds, the final confirmation that her husband had considered her worth precisely nothing. She took a breath, then another. Then she lifted her eyes. The house sat in a large clearing surrounded by those ancient oaks standing like sentinels. It was old, built from gray fieldstone that had to date back to at least the early 1800s. 2 stories with a steep slate roof that looked remarkably intact. White painted wooden trim around leaded glass windows. A heavy oak front door under a small covered portico with hand-carved supports that spoke of craftsmanship from an era when people built things to last centuries, not decades. Ivy grew up portions of the stone walls, but not in the choking, destructive way of genuine neglect. In a decorative, almost intentional pattern, like something from an English country estate. The grounds surrounding the house were overgrown, but clearly had once been formal gardens. Eleanor could see the bones of the original design beneath the wild growth. Stone pathways partially hidden by grass. Organized beds where roses had gone wild and beautiful. What had been a kitchen garden, now given over to a gorgeous tangle of herbs and wildflowers. A stone fountain, dry and silent, but still elegant, standing in what had obviously been a carefully planned garden area. It was not a ruin. It was not a dump. It was wild and overgrown and untamed, but it was also hauntingly, unexpectedly, heartbreakingly beautiful. Like a secret garden that time had partially reclaimed, but could not quite bring itself to destroy. Eleanor was still sitting in her car, trying to process what her eyes were telling her brain, when she heard footsteps approaching on the dirt road from the direction of town. An elderly woman was walking toward her with purpose that seemed to belong to someone 20 years younger. She wore a simple cotton dress and carried a wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth, and she moved with the confident stride of a person who has walked this particular road many times and knows every root and stone by heart. "You are Eleanor," the woman said when she reached the car. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered with complete certainty, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment for a very long time. "Yes," Eleanor climbed out on legs that felt unreliable. "How did you know that?" "We have been waiting for you." The woman said it simply, the way you might say the sun rises in the east. A fact so obvious it barely required stating. "Walter told us you would come eventually after he passed. He said to watch for a woman named Eleanor driving an older Honda. I am Margaret Holloway. I run the general store in town." She held out the basket. "Fresh bread, eggs from her neighbor's chickens, milk, coffee, local cheese. Figured you might need supplies. The house has been maintained, but there is no food stocked." Eleanor took the basket automatically, her mind struggling to bridge the enormous gap between what she had expected to find here and what was actually happening. "Walter told you." "When?" "He never once mentioned this place to me. In 40 years of marriage." Margaret's expression shifted into something that looked like understanding layered over sadness, layered over something deeper that Eleanor could not identify. "Walter came here regularly for 40 years, dear. Once a month at the very least. Sometimes more. He maintained the house, spent time here, took care of the property. He told us that when he died, his wife Eleanor would inherit this place. He said you would not know about it beforehand because he had kept it secret for your protection." My protection. Eleanor felt the ground beneath her feet become suddenly unreliable, as if reality itself had developed a crack. Protection from what? From them, I imagine, Margaret said gently. The ones who took everything else. His children. Walter said they had never accepted you, that they had always resented your marriage, and that if they knew about this property and what it contained, they would find legal ways to claim it. So he hid it from everyone, even you, until his death would make the inheritance final and legally unassailable. She started walking toward the house, gesturing for Eleanor to follow. Come on, I will help you get settled. The house is unlocked. Walter never locked it. He said if someone needed shelter, they were welcome to it. That was the kind of man he was, at least here. At least here. As if there were two Walters. The one Eleanor had known in Boston, distant and secretive and ultimately devastating, and another one entirely who existed in this place, in this town, among these people. Eleanor followed Margaret up the stone pathway. Margaret produced the rusty iron key from Eleanor's envelope and turned it smoothly in the lock. The heavy oak door swung open with barely a sound, revealing the interior. Welcome to your sanctuary, Margaret said quietly, stepping aside. That is what Walter called it. The sanctuary. Welcome home, Eleanor. Eleanor crossed the threshold and felt everything she thought she understood about her marriage, her husband, and her own life shift, beneath her like tectonic plates rearranging themselves in real time. The interior was beautiful, not falling apart, not abandoned, not decrepit, beautiful. Wide plank wood floors that glowed with the deep patina that only comes from age and decades of careful hand waxing. A massive stone fireplace dominating one wall, its mantel carved from a single piece of oak with a craftsmanship that would make modern woodworkers weep. A comfortable leather sofa worn soft with use. Several reading chairs positioned to catch the best light. Built-in bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. Hand-woven rugs and soft, muted earth tones. Leaded glass windows casting patterns of forest, filtered light across every surface. And everywhere covering every available inch of wall space, arranged on shelves, standing on surfaces displayed with the careful curation of a private museum dedicated to a single subject, were framed photographs. Photographs of Eleanor. Eleanor on their wedding day, 28 years old, and radiant so full of hope that it hurt to look at from the distance of 40 years. Eleanor in the Brookline garden, kneeling in soil with dirt on her hands and unguarded joy on her face. Eleanor laughing at something, the camera catching a moment of pure happiness that she did not even remember experiencing. Eleanor reading in a chair, afternoon light in her hair. Eleanor sleeping peacefully, the same photograph she had found behind the dresser. But this was a different copy, larger, framed in silver, given a place of honor on the mantel. Eleanor at 30, at 40, at 50, at 60, in every season, in every light, in every unguarded moment that Walter had apparently spent 40 years secretly documenting with the devoted attention of a man who was desperately, hopelessly, completely in love. He loved you very much, Margaret said from behind her. Anyone who walked into this house knew that immediately. This was his shrine to you, Eleanor. His secret place where he could come and be the man he actually was underneath all the expectations and performance of his Boston life. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. They came without warning and without permission, the way water comes through a dam that has finally developed one crack too many to hold. She had not cried like this at the funeral. She had been too shocked. She had not cried during the will reading. She had been too numb. She had not cried during the 30 days of being systematically erased from the only home she had known. But here, surrounded by 100 photographs of herself taken with love by a man she had believed had forgotten her, she broke. Margaret let her cry, without interruption, without platitudes, without any of the well-meaning, but ultimately useless things that people say to grief. She simply stood quietly and let the silence hold what words could not. Then she guided Eleanor to the leather sofa and said, "Let me show you the rest. Then I will leave you to rest. But first you need to see everything. You need to understand what Walter really left you." The kitchen was a charming blend of old and new. An antique wood-burning stove sitting alongside modern appliances, copper pots hanging from wrought iron racks, a deep farmhouse sink, open shelving displaying beautiful hand-thrown pottery that Eleanor had never seen before. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms each, simply but comfortably furnished. The master bedroom had its own fireplace and windows overlooking the forest canopy and more photographs of Eleanor. Dozens more, including candid shots she had never known existed taken without her awareness over the span of decades, capturing her in ordinary moments of simply living her life. The house has been maintained through a fund Walter established, Margaret explained, as they walked back downstairs. He set up an arrangement with the local bank years ago. Utilities, property taxes, basic maintenance repairs insurance. All of it covered for the next 50 years. You will never have to worry about those expenses. They reached a door beneath the staircase that Eleanor had not noticed before. Margaret opened it to reveal a small study, maybe 10 feet by 12, with no windows. Three walls were lined floor to ceiling with built-in shelving that held not books, but folders, binders, and document boxes, all meticulously labeled in Walter's precise handwriting. The fourth wall contained a beautiful antique mahogany desk with a green-shaded banker's lamp and a leather chair. And there, in the center of the desk, positioned with unmistakable intent, was a thick, cream-colored envelope with the words, "My beloved Eleanor," written across it in Walter's familiar script. "This," Margaret said softly, "is what he really wanted you to find. This is why he built the sanctuary." Eleanor picked up the envelope with hands that trembled so violently she nearly dropped it. She broke the wax seal and pulled out 5 pages of Walter's handwriting. "My dearest, most beloved Eleanor, if you are reading this, I am gone and you found the sanctuary. I am desperately, profoundly sorry it had to happen this way." The letter explained everything. Walter had inherited the property from his uncle Thomas Hawthorne in June of 1984, 3 months after his wedding to Eleanor. Thomas was a bachelor and quiet historian who had lived simply despite considerable wealth. His will contained one instruction: protect this place for someone you love more than life itself. It deserves to shelter love, not greed. For 40 years, Walter had been protecting it for Eleanor. The will he wrote was deliberate. Every humiliating word was calculated. He knew Preston, Cordelia, and Bennett would read every line looking for weaknesses, looking for anything they could challenge. So he gave them exactly what they wanted: the visible wealth, the obvious assets, the things they could display and brag about. But what he actually gave them, he explained with the precision of a man who had spent 50 years practicing law, was carefully constructed misery. The Brookline mansion was mortgaged heavily. Walter had taken out substantial loans against it in the final years, and the heirs would discover they were now responsible for those payments. Historical preservation easements he had placed on the property years ago would require months of committee reviews and neighborhood approvals before any sale could proceed. Quick profit was impossible. The investment accounts were locked in complex trusts with conditions designed to make access extraordinarily difficult. Preston's share required continuous employment verified by tax returns and annual character evaluations by an independent trustee, a retired judge Walter had selected specifically for his rigorous ethical standards. Cordelia's trust required proof of stable family relationships, which, given her 3 divorces and estranged children, was virtually impossible to satisfy. Bennett's inheritance was structured as an active management trust that would dissolve entirely and go to charity if he did not personally oversee every investment decision. Walter had given his children exactly enough rope to hang themselves financially while believing they had won everything. And to Eleanor, he had given something else entirely. The house sat on 247 acres of protected woodland. Conservation groups had already expressed serious interest. Total value of land and structures approximately $4 million. The deed was in Eleanor's name alone, established in 1984 as a separate gift completely independent of the marriage, legally untouchable by any claim or challenge. But beyond money, he wrote, "I gave you freedom, and I gave you protection." The filing cabinets in this study contain documentation I accumulated over 40 years of legal practice. Information about powerful families, influential people, those who believed their secrets were safely buried. I never used this information, but I kept it organized because information is insurance. If Preston, Cordelia, or Bennett ever discover this property and try to challenge your ownership, you have the means to defend yourself. The letter ended with words that Eleanor read 3 times through, tears that would not stop. "You were the best part of my life, the only pure, real, genuine thing in a life that was otherwise performance and obligation, and keeping peace with people who did not deserve the peace I gave them. I am sorry I was too much of a coward to stand up to my children publicly. I am sorry I made you feel second best when you were always, always first. I failed you in life by being weak. I hope I have succeeded in death by being clever. Forever and always yours, Walter. Eleanor set down the letter. She looked at Margaret, who was standing in the doorway with tears on her own cheeks. He was a complicated man, Margaret said. Flawed, weak in some ways. But his love for you was the one thing about him that was never complicated. And for the first time since Walter Hawthorne had died, Eleanor felt something other than grief or rage or fear. She felt something that had been dead for so long she almost did not recognize it when it stirred. Hope. The weeks that followed were the closest thing to peace that Eleanor had experienced in 40 years, maybe in her entire life. She settled into the sanctuary with the cautious wonder of someone who has been given a gift so unexpected that they keep checking to make sure it has not been taken away while they slept. She woke each morning to the sound of birds in the ancient oaks and the filtered green light coming through the leaded glass windows, and for several seconds before full consciousness arrived, she felt something she could not immediately name. It took her nearly a week to identify it. Absence of fear. She was waking up without dread for the first time in decades. Margaret came by every day, sometimes with food, sometimes with company, always with the easy warmth of a woman who had decided that Eleanor belonged to Cedarwood, and that was that. Through Margaret, Eleanor began to meet the town. And through the town, she began to meet the Walter she had never known. Pastor Whitfield, a kind man with weathered hands and gentle eyes, told her that Walter had funded the complete roof replacement on the church 3 years ago, would not allow a plaque or any public acknowledgement, just said a church needs a sound roof to shelter its congregation, and wrote a check. Ruth Patterson, who had lived in Cedarwood her entire 81 years, told Eleanor that Walter had paid for her grandson's full college tuition, set it up as an anonymous scholarship through the Community Foundation. Changed that boy's trajectory entirely. First person in 3 generations of Pattersons to earn a degree. Sarah, the young librarian, explained that when state budget cuts threatened to close the library permanently, Walter had arrived one afternoon and presented a check for new books, building repairs, and 3 years of operating expenses. Said a town without a library was not really a town at all. Walter had lived a completely different life in Cedarwood. Here he had been generous without condition, engaged with people without performance, kind in tangible material ways that left permanent marks on the community. Here he had been the man he wanted to be, free from the expectations and pressures and bitter family dynamics that had compressed him into someone smaller in Boston. He talked about you constantly, Margaret told Eleanor one evening. They were sitting on the restored stone porch drinking tea and watching the forest darken into evening. Every single visit he would stop by the store and we would talk. He always wanted to know if I thought the house was ready for you, if there was anything more that should be done. He showed me photographs on his phone and told me stories. He said you were the only person who had ever loved him for who he actually was, not for what he could provide or accomplish. He said keeping this place secret from his children was the hardest and most important thing he had ever done. Eleanor spent those early weeks restoring the gardens. It was the thing she knew how to do, the thing that had always been authentically hers, even when nothing else was. She cleared the overgrown pathways stone by stone. She pruned the wild roses back into something approaching their original design. She replanted the kitchen garden with herbs and vegetables from seeds Margaret brought her. She got the fountain running again, clear water splashing over moss-covered stone. She hired 2 young men from town to help with the heavier work, and they showed up every morning at 8 with the cheerful reliability of people who genuinely enjoyed the labor. She paid them well from a small account Robert Kessler had helped her establish using funds from the Maintenance Trust. She volunteered at the library every Tuesday and Thursday, shelving books and helping organize the children's reading program. She attended the white church every Sunday, sitting in the same pew, greeted by name by people who seemed genuinely uncomplicated. Happy to see her. For the first time in her adult life, Eleanor Hawthorne had friends, real friends, people who knew her name and used it, people who asked how she was doing and waited for the actual answer, people who wanted her company not because she was attached to a powerful man, but because she was Eleanor, and Eleanor was someone worth knowing. She belonged somewhere, and that belonging had nothing to do with being anyone's wife. She was beginning to believe carefully and with the caution of someone who has been burned very badly that she might actually be safe, that Walter's plan had worked, that the worst was behind her and the rest of her life, however much of it remained, might actually be something worth living. She was wrong. The phone call from Robert Kessler came on a Thursday morning, 7 weeks after Eleanor had arrived in Cedarwood. She was in the garden, hands deep in soil, the autumn sun warm on her back when her phone rang. "Eleanor, I hope you are settling in well." Robert's voice had the particular careful quality it took on when he was about to deliver information he wished he did not have to share. "I need to give you a heads up. Preston retained attorneys yesterday, a firm called Hargrove and Associates. They are expensive and they are aggressive." "What are they claiming?" "He is arguing that the Cedarwood property should be considered a marital asset subject to equitable division. He claims Walter deliberately concealed and undervalued it in the estate documents. He wants a court to force a sale and divide proceeds 4 ways." Eleanor's hand tightened around the phone. She looked at the garden she had been rebuilding, at the house she had been learning to love, at the life she had been so carefully, so tentatively beginning to construct. "Let him try, Robert," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I have documentation showing this property was deeded to me in 1984 as a gift." Walter set it up very carefully. "I know," Robert said. "I helped him do it. But Eleanor, there is more. They are not just challenging ownership. They have filed a motion to freeze the maintenance trust pending resolution. If the court grants it, you will lose access to the funds that pay for utilities, taxes, insurance, everything. And these cases can take months, sometimes years." The ground that had felt so solid beneath her feet 5 minutes ago turned to sand. 3 days after the phone call, it got worse. Cordelia came to Cedarwood, not to the house, to the town. She arrived in a black sedan that looked obscenely expensive, parked on Main Street, and she spent an entire afternoon visiting shops, introducing herself to residents, having coffee at the diner. She was charming. She was sympathetic. She was a grieving daughter concerned about her elderly stepmother's mental state and the suspicious circumstances surrounding a hidden property that her dear father had never mentioned to his own children. She did not make accusations. She did not need to. She planted seeds. Our father was not himself in his final years. His judgment was compromised. We are concerned that certain people may have taken advantage of his declining mental state. Eleanor heard about Cordelia's visit from Margaret, who reported it with the compressed fury of a woman who does not lose her temper often, but is very close to making an exception. "She was good," Margaret said grimly. "I will give her that. She was very, very good. She cried at all the right moments. She talked about how much she loved her father. She implied, without ever quite stating, that you had manipulated Walter into hiding assets from his rightful heirs. And some people believed her, the Hendersons, the Reeves family, maybe others." Eleanor felt the community she had been so carefully building begin to fracture around her. People who had waved to her on Main Street now looked away. The young men who had been helping with the garden called to say they could not come anymore. Their mother had concerns. 1 week later, the court granted the temporary freeze. Eleanor's maintenance fund was locked. No access to the money that paid for heat, electricity, water insurance, property taxes. Everything frozen pending resolution of a case that could drag on for months. November was coming. Massachusetts winters are not gentle with stone houses and elderly women who have no money to pay for heating oil. That night, Eleanor sat alone in Walter's study. The banker's lamp cast a small circle of green-tinged light. The filing cabinets stood in shadow along the walls. Walter's letter lay on the desk, and she read it again for what might have been the 20th time, and for the first time the words did not comfort her. She had trusted Walter, again. She had come to this place because he asked her to trust him one last time. She had found the house and the photographs in the letter, and she had believed with the desperate willingness of someone who needed it to be true that Walter's plan was airtight, that his 40 years of preparation had been sufficient, that love expressed through legal documents and hidden property and secret trusts was enough to protect her. But it was not enough, because Preston had lawyers too. Expensive, aggressive, relentless lawyers who were very good at their jobs and who had found a way to take even this from her. Eleanor sat in that small, windowless room, surrounded by filing cabinets full of secrets she did not know how to use, and she felt something worse than the fear she had felt in Brookline. Worse than the humiliation of the will reading. Worse than the cruelty of the 30 days. She felt the specific annihilating pain of having been given hope and then having it systematically dismantled. It is one thing to have nothing. It is another thing entirely to have something to believe in it, to begin building a life on it, and then to watch it being taken away piece by people who already have everything and simply cannot tolerate the idea that you might have something too. She was worse off now than she had been the day she left Brookline, because now she had something to lose. The first frost came to Cedarwood on a Tuesday morning in late November, coating the garden Eleanor had rebuilt with a thin layer of white that made everything look fragile and temporary. She stood at the kitchen window, watching the ice crystals catch the early light, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that was growing cold because she had forgotten she was holding it. The heating oil tank was at a quarter. The electricity bill was 3 weeks past due. The property tax notice sat unopened on the kitchen table because opening it would make the number inside real, and Eleanor was not ready for it to be real. The maintenance trust remained frozen by court order, every penny locked behind legal proceedings that Preston's attorneys were deliberately, methodically dragging out. Margaret brought firewood, 2 cords stacked neatly beside the back door, delivered by her nephew, without being asked and without any discussion of payment. Pastor Whitfield stopped by with a casserole in the name of a pro bono legal aid organization 2 towns over. Ruth Patterson sent her grandson, the one Walter had put through college, to check the furnace and make sure the pipes were properly insulated against the coming freeze. Cedarwood took care of its own. Most of Cedarwood anyway. The fracture Cordelia had created was still visible. Some residents still avoided Eleanor's eyes on Main Street. The Hendersons had stopped coming to the library on the days Eleanor volunteered. But the people who stayed completely. And Eleanor was learning that a small number of people who believe in you is worth infinitely more than a large number who are polite to you because you are married to someone important. Still, belief does not pay heating bills, and courage does not keep pipes from freezing. Robert Kessler called on the 1st of December with an update that was not an update. The case was proceeding. Preston's attorneys were requesting additional discovery. They wanted access to the property for an independent appraisal. They wanted financial records going back 40 years. They wanted depositions from Margaret and other Cedarwood residents about Walter's activities. They are building a narrative, Robert explained. The story they want to tell the court is that Walter was mentally declining in his later years, and that you exercised undue influence over his decisions regarding this property. They do not have evidence because it did not happen, but they do not need to prove it conclusively. They just need to create enough doubt to keep the freeze in place and drag this out until you cannot afford to fight anymore. How long, Eleanor asked. Could be 6 months, could be 18, could be longer. These things move slowly when one side wants them to move slowly and has the money to ensure they do. Eleanor hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table for a very long time. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the antique clock on the living room mantel and the occasional creak of old wood settling against cold. Walter's letter was in the desk drawer in the study. She did not need to read it again. She had memorized every word. I know you are strong enough. You just have never been allowed to show it. Easy words to write, easy words for a dead man to leave behind like a fortune cookie message tucked inside a crisis. But Walter was not here. Walter was not sitting in a cold house watching his savings frozen and his community divided and his carefully constructed plan being dismantled by the same people it was designed to protect against. Eleanor was here. Eleanor was alone. And Eleanor was beginning to wonder if Walter had been wrong about her. Margaret came by that evening and found Eleanor sitting in the study, not reading, not working, just sitting in Walter's chair, with her hands in her lap and an expression on her face that Margaret had never seen before. What are you thinking? Margaret asked. I am thinking about giving up, Eleanor said. And the honesty of it, the raw, undecorated admission, cost her more than anything she had said in 68 years of living. She laid it out with the calm precision of someone who has done the math and cannot make the numbers work. She could negotiate with Preston, surrender the property, accept a settlement, maybe $200,000 or $300,000. Enough to rent a small apartment somewhere. Enough to live quietly and modestly for however many years she had left. Not the life Walter had envisioned for her, but a life. A predictable, controllable, survivable life. Or she could fight, with no money for attorneys, with a community that was partially turned against her, with a legal system that moved at the speed of money, which meant it moved very quickly for Preston and very slowly for her. She could fight and she could lose everything, including the settlement she could get now by walking away. Margaret sat across from her and said nothing for a long time. The silence between them had the quality of something being carefully weighed. Then Margaret said, "What do you think Walter would want you to do?" Eleanor almost laughed. "Walter would want me to fight. Walter left me a letter telling me I was strong enough. But Walter also left me alone to face his children without any resources except a house I cannot heat and filing cabinets full of secrets I do not know how to use." Then maybe Margaret said, "It is time to learn how to use them." It started with the filing cabinets. Eleanor had avoided them until now. They felt like Walter's domain. His world of legal strategy and information warfare and the quiet power games that powerful people play behind closed doors. She was a secretary. She was a gardener. She was a woman who made coffee and hosted dinner parties and kept her mouth shut for 40 years. She was unequipped for this. Except she had spent 40 years living with one of Boston's sharpest legal minds. She had typed his briefs. She had organized his files. She had listened to him discuss strategy with colleagues over dinners she had cooked and served. She had absorbed, without ever intending to, an education in legal thinking that no law school could have provided because it was practical, not theoretical. It was how law actually worked in the real world, not how textbooks said it should work. She opened the first cabinet. The files were immaculate. Walter had organized them with the obsessive precision of a man who expected someone else to eventually need to navigate them without his guidance. Each folder was labeled. Each document was dated. Each piece of information was cross-referenced to related files. The first cabinet contained property documents. The deed from 1984 clearly establishing the Cedarwood property as a separate gift, not a marital asset. Trust documents for the maintenance fund. Appraisals from 3 different firms over the years. Letters from conservation organizations expressing interest in the land. Everything Robert Kessler had described, but more detailed, more thorough, more legally airtight than she had imagined. The second cabinet was different. These folders bore the names of prominent Boston families, corporations, public figures, documentation of deals arrangements, relationships, payments, connections, the accumulated intelligence of a man who had spent 50 years at the center of Boston's legal establishment and who had kept meticulous records of everything he had seen, heard, and handled. Not blackmail material. Walter had been clear about that. He had never used any of it. But he had preserved it with the understanding that information carefully documented and properly organized is the most potent form of insurance that exists. The third cabinet made Eleanor's breath catch. A thick folder labeled Preston Hawthorne, Cordelia Hawthorne Sinclair, and Bennett Hawthorne, personal and financial records. She pulled it out and sat at Walter's desk and read. What she found was devastating in its thoroughness. Walter had documented his own children's financial lives with the same precision he had applied to everything else. Preston's business dealings included several transactions that would not survive scrutiny from financial regulators. Cordelia's divorce settlements contained arrangements regarding asset concealment that her former husband's attorneys had apparently missed. Bennett's company had accounting irregularities that would interest the IRS considerably. Walter had known about all of it. He had documented all of it, and he had left it for Eleanor with a note clipped to the inside cover. Use only if you must, but know that it exists. Your protection was always my first priority, even when I was too weak to protect you openly. But there was something else in the third cabinet that Eleanor had not expected, something that changed everything. Beneath the folder on his children, beneath the financial records and the legal documentation, Walter had placed a second envelope, thinner than the first letter, sealed with wax, labeled simply, Strategy. Eleanor opened it. Inside was not a letter, it was a legal brief. 5 pages of precise, methodical legal argumentation written in Walter's hand, but structured exactly like the court documents Eleanor had typed for him thousands of times over the years. It outlined step by step a defense strategy for exactly the situation she was now facing. He had anticipated this. Of course he had. He had spent 50 years as a trial attorney. He knew his own children. He knew they would challenge the will. He knew they would find the property. He knew they would try to freeze the trust and drag out proceedings and grind Eleanor down through attrition. And he had written her a roadmap for fighting back. The strategy was elegant. It did not require an expensive law firm. It did not require months of discovery or depositions or procedural maneuvering. It required Eleanor to file a specific motion with the probate court presenting the 1984 deed and the trust documentation in a particular sequence that would legally compel the court to lift the freeze immediately because the property had never been part of the marital estate and therefore could not be subject to estate proceedings. But the strategy required one thing that Walter could not do for her from beyond the grave. It required Eleanor to stand up in court herself, to present the motion personally, to speak clearly and precisely in front of a judge, in front of Preston and Cordelia and their expensive attorneys, and to argue her own case with her own voice. Walter's note at the bottom of the brief was the last thing he would ever write to her. I know you can do this. You spent 40 years learning law by osmosis, sitting beside me, typing my words, listening to my strategies. You know more than you think you know. You are smarter than anyone has ever given you credit for, including me. I am sorry that I cannot be there beside you. But I believe in you, Eleanor. I have always believed in you. Now it is time for you to believe in yourself. Eleanor set down the brief. She sat in the green lamplight for a very long time. The house was absolutely silent around her, the kind of silence that exists only in places surrounded by forest, the kind of silence that does not press on you but holds you. Then she picked up a pen, pulled a legal pad from the desk drawer, and began to work. She worked for 3 days. She read every document in the first cabinet twice. She studied Walter's strategy brief until she could recite it from memory. She called Robert Kessler and told him what she was planning, and he was quiet for a long time before he said, Eleanor, that brief is legally sound. Walter knew what he was doing. But appearing pro se in probate court against Hargrove and Associates is going to be intimidating. I have been intimidated by those people for 40 years, Robert. I am finished being intimidated. She filed the motion on a Monday. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. But before the hearing, something happened that Eleanor had not anticipated and could not have prepared for. Bennett came to Cedarwood. He came alone, driving a car that was expensive but not ostentatious, parking it at the end of Winding Creek Road, and walking the last quarter mile through the forest to the house. Eleanor saw him coming from the upstairs window and watched his approach with the wary attention of someone who has learned to treat every member of a particular family as a potential threat. But Bennett did not look threatening. He looked like a 56-year-old man who had not slept well in weeks and who was carrying something heavy that had nothing to do with the briefcase in his hand. Eleanor met him on the porch. She did not invite him inside. They stood facing each other in the November cold, their breath visible in the air between them, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. I am not here because of the lawsuit, Bennett said finally. His voice was quieter than she remembered. More uncertain. I am here because I need to say something to you, and I need to say it before the hearing. Eleanor waited. Bennett looked at the house, at the photographs visible through the windows, at the garden Eleanor had restored, at the evidence of his father's love that was everywhere you looked in this place. I knew, he said. Not everything, not about this house or the property or the money, but I knew he loved you. I could see it, the way he looked at you when you were not paying attention, the way he said your name, the way his whole body changed when he came home and heard your voice in the kitchen. I saw it my whole life, and I never said anything because saying it would have meant admitting that our mother leaving was not your fault, that Father did not choose you over us, that people can love more than one way without taking anything away from anyone. His voice cracked on the last sentence, not dramatically, not performatively. The small, involuntary breaking that happens when someone finally says something they have been carrying for decades. Eleanor looked at this man, who had been 16 years old at her wedding, angry and confused and resentful, and who was now 56 and still carrying the weight of a child's fear that his father's love was a finite resource that had to be divided rather than multiplied. Love is not a pie, Bennett Eleanor said. Nobody gets a smaller piece because someone else is at the table. Bennett looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded once, a slow, heavy movement that seemed to cost him something. I am withdrawing from the lawsuit, he said. I already told Preston. He is furious. Cordelia called me a traitor, but I cannot do this anymore. I cannot stand in a courtroom and try to take from you the only thing our father ever did right. He turned and walked back down the dirt road toward his car, and Eleanor stood on the porch and watched him go, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Compassion. For a man who had spent 40 years being afraid that his father's love for his wife meant less love for his children. A man who had finally, at 56, understood that it did not work that way. The hearing was on Thursday. Eleanor drove to the courthouse in Boston wearing a simple dark blue dress and carrying a leather folder containing every document she needed organized in the exact sequence Walter's strategy brief had specified. Her hands were steady on the steering wheel. Her mind was clear. She had not slept much in the preceding nights, but it was not fear that had kept her awake. It was preparation. The courtroom was smaller than she had imagined. Probate courts lacked the grandeur of criminal courts. No jury box, no gallery of spectators, just a judge's bench, 2 tables, a court reporter, and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. Preston sat at one table with 2 attorneys from Hargrove and associates men in suits that cost more than Eleanor's car-carrying briefcases that probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget. Cordelia sat behind them in the gallery section, her expression carefully arranged into concerned sympathy. Bennett was absent. His chair at the table was empty, and Preston's jaw was set in a way that suggested this absence was a wound he had not yet finished bleeding from. Eleanor sat at the other table alone. No attorney, no advisor, no one. The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and reading glasses perched on her nose, looked at Eleanor over those glasses with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been concern. Mrs. Hawthorne, are you representing yourself in this matter? I am, Your Honor. You understand that the opposing party is represented by counsel and that the court cannot provide you with legal advice during these proceedings. I understand completely, Your Honor. Very well. You may present your motion. Eleanor stood. She opened the leather folder. She took one breath, held it for a count of 3, and released it. Then she began to speak. She spoke clearly, precisely, without emotion and without hesitation. The way she had listened to Walter speak in 1,000 professional conversations, the way she had typed 1,000 legal briefs, the way you speak when you know your facts are correct and your argument is sound, and the only thing required of you is to present them in the proper order. She presented the 1984 deed first, established the property as the gift separate from the marriage dating any marital asset claim by 4 decades. She presented the trust documentation showing the maintenance fund as an independent entity with no connection to the marital estate. She presented 3 separate legal opinions, each commissioned by Walter over the years, each confirming the property's status as a non-marital asset. She spoke for 22 minutes. She did not stumble. She did not lose her place. She did not look at Preston or Cordelia or the expensive attorneys who were exchanging increasingly uncomfortable glances as she methodically dismantled every argument they had constructed. When she finished, she sat down. Her hands were not trembling. Her heart was beating fast but steady, the way a heart beats during exertion rather than panic. Preston's lead attorney stood to respond, but his response was notably shorter and less confident than Eleanor suspected he had planned. The documents she had presented were originals, notarized, and dated, and they said exactly what Eleanor had told the court they said. There was no ambiguity to exploit, no gap in the chain of documentation, no angle of attack that Walter had not anticipated and preemptively closed. The judge retired to consider the motion and returned in 40 minutes, which Robert Kessler would later tell Eleanor was remarkably fast for a decision of this complexity. The court finds that the property at 31 Winding Creek Road, Cedarwood, Massachusetts, was established as a separate gift to Eleanor Ann Hawthorne in 1984 and does not constitute a marital asset subject to division under the estate proceedings currently before this court. The temporary freeze on the Associated Maintenance Trust is hereby lifted effective immediately. The petitioner's motion for inclusion of this property in the estate is denied. Preston's face went white. Cordelia in the gallery made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a word. The expensive attorneys began speaking to each other in low, rapid voices that contained no trace of the confidence they had carried into the room. Eleanor gathered her documents, placed them back in the leather folder, and stood. She walked past Preston's table on her way to the door, and she stopped. Not because she had planned to, not because she wanted confrontation, but because she had one more thing to do. She placed a second folder on the table in front of Preston's lead attorney, a folder she had prepared the night before containing selected pages from Walter's third filing cabinet. Not everything, just enough. She spoke quietly so that only the people at that table could hear. Your father spent 40 years documenting the financial activities of everyone he encountered professionally, including his own children. This folder contains a representative sample. There is considerably more where this came from. I have no desire to use any of it. I have no desire to cause harm to anyone. But I want to be very clear about something. If there is any further challenge to my ownership of the Cedarwood property, if there is any attempt to interfere with my life or my community or my peace, everything your father documented will be made available to the appropriate authorities and to the press. Not as revenge, as protection. She looked at Preston, who was staring at the folder without touching it as if it might be radioactive. Your father loved you, Eleanor said. In his complicated, imperfect way, he loved all three of you. But he loved me too. He just was not brave enough to show it while he was alive. I think you can understand that kind of weakness. You have been living with your own version of it for 40 years. She walked out of the courtroom without looking back. She made it to her car in the parking garage before she allowed herself to sit and breathe and feel the full weight of what had just happened. She had won. Not because Walter had won for her from beyond the grave. He had given her the tools. He had prepared the strategy. He had organized the documentation. But Eleanor had been the one to stand up. Eleanor had been the one to walk into that courtroom alone and speak in her own voice and refuse finally after 68 years to be invisible. The drive back to Cedarwood took 2 hours and 22 minutes. The same distance, the same roads, the same forest closing around her as she turned onto Winding Creek Road. But everything was different. She was different. Margaret was waiting on the porch when Eleanor pulled up to the house. Margaret, who had brought bread and eggs on the first day. Margaret, who had shown her the sanctuary. Margaret, who had brought firewood when the money ran out, and who had never once, not for a single moment, doubted that Eleanor belonged here. Margaret took one look at Eleanor's face and opened her arms and held her while Eleanor cried for the last time. Not tears of grief or fear or exhaustion, tears of something she had almost forgotten existed. Relief. Pure, clean, absolute relief. You fought, Margaret said. Walter told me you would. He said you were the strongest person he had ever known, and that you just needed permission to show it. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that the aftermath of storms is quiet. Not empty silence, but the rich, full silence of things settling into their proper places. Preston and Cordelia dropped the lawsuit within a week. Robert Kessler handled the final paperwork. The will was settled and closed. The maintenance trust was unfrozen, and Eleanor would never again have to worry about heating oil or electricity or property taxes. The Brookline mansion eventually sold, but only after 9 months on the market. The historical preservation requirements in the mortgage Walter had placed on it meant the siblings netted far less than they had anticipated. Their trust restrictions proved to be exactly as complicated and frustrating as Walter had designed them to be. His quiet, perfectly legal, mathematically precise revenge played out over months, each new restriction, revealing itself at the exact moment it would cause maximum inconvenience. The Cedarwood residents, who had been swayed by Cordelia's visit, came back gradually, one by one, with the sheepish apologies of people who know they were manipulated and are embarrassed by how easily it happened. Eleanor accepted every apology with grace because she understood something about manipulation that Cordelia never would. It works best on decent people. The fact that they had been susceptible to Cordelia's lies meant they were the kind of people who gave others the benefit of the doubt. That was not a flaw. That was a quality worth forgiving. Eleanor continued her work on the gardens through the winter, planning spring plantings and sketching designs by firelight in the evenings. She expanded her volunteer work at the library. She joined the church choir, discovering at 68 that she had a pleasant alto voice that she had simply never used. She hosted Margaret for dinner every Sunday evening, cooking elaborate meals in the kitchen that blended antique charm with modern convenience meals that were eaten slowly and appreciated fully, and followed by long conversations that lasted until the fire burned low. She was building a life, not the life Walter had imagined for her exactly, but a life that grew from the foundation he had provided. Her own life, shaped by her own choices and her own preferences and her own slowly emerging understanding of who Eleanor Hawthorne actually was when she was not performing the role of someone else's wife. It was during one of her evening sessions in Walter's study, organizing the filing cabinets into a system that made sense to her rather than to him, that she found it. Tucked into the back of the bottom drawer of the mahogany desk behind a false panel that she discovered only because she was cleaning the drawer thoroughly and noticed that the measurements did not quite add up. A final envelope, sealed with wax, labeled in Walter's handwriting, for Eleanor's future. Open when you are ready. She sat with it in her hands for a long time, feeling its weight, wondering if she was ready, wondering what ready even meant. Then she broke the seal. Inside was documentation for a trust fund, $500,000 specifically established for whatever projects or purposes Eleanor Hawthorne chooses to pursue in her new life. And a note, the last words Walter Hawthorne would ever write. You spent 40 years living my life, Eleanor, hosting my parties, managing my home, accommodating my secrets, enduring my children. You gave me everything, and I gave you silence, in distance, in a will that made you cry in a parking garage. This money is not compensation. Nothing could compensate for what I failed to give you while I was alive. This is a blank canvas. Paint it however makes you happy. Build something. Create something. Transform something. Whatever you do, do it for yourself. Not for me, not for my memory, not for my legacy, for you. You deserve a legacy of your own. Eleanor sat in the green lamplight and read those words and knew with the sudden clarity that comes when you have been circling an idea for months without quite landing on it exactly what she wanted to do. She would create a retreat, a place for women who, like her, had spent their lives in service to others and had arrived at a point where they needed space and time and community to figure out who they were when they were not being someone else's support system. A place for widows finding their way, for women leaving difficult situations, for anyone who needed sanctuary and permission to start over regardless of their age or their circumstances or how completely the world had written them off. She would call it Hawthorne House, not Morrison House, not Walter's house, Hawthorne House, because the name was hers now. She had earned it. Not by marriage, but by survival, by endurance, by standing alone in a courtroom and speaking in her own voice and refusing finally to be invisible. Spring came to Cedarwood the way spring always comes to New England, slowly, reluctantly, and then all at once. The ancient oaks leafed out in stages, first a faint green haze, then full canopy, transforming the tunnel of Winding Creek Road into a cathedral of living green. Eleanor's gardens erupted. The roses she had pruned back in autumn came roaring to life, blooming in colors she had not seen since the Brookline house. The herbs in the kitchen garden grew with a particular enthusiasm of plants that have been waiting in good soil for someone who knows what they are doing. The fountain splashed steadily clear water over mossy stone, and songbirds nested in the ivy on the walls. On a Saturday morning in May, Eleanor sat on the stone porch with a cup of coffee and a legal pad sketching plans for Hawthorne House. Margaret sat beside her, offering opinions that were always practical and occasionally brilliant. The sun was warm, the forest was alive with birdsong. The air smelled of earth and roses and the particular sweetness of a New England spring that is finally committed to arriving. Eleanor was 68 years old. She had spent 4 decades being exactly who everyone else needed her to be: the efficient secretary, the accommodating wife, the invisible stepmother, the gracious hostess, the woman who never made waves or demanded anything for herself. But here in this sanctuary built from love and protected by patience and delivered through the most devastating, roundabout, heartbreaking act of devotion she could imagine, Eleanor Hawthorne was finally free. Free to discover that she had a talent for organization that could build something from nothing. Free to discover that she had a gift for making people feel welcome that had been wasted on dinner parties for people who never noticed her. Free to discover that she had strength. She had never been permitted to use courage. She had never been given reason to show, and a voice that once she finally raised it carried a quiet authority that filled courtrooms, in committee meetings, and Sunday morning conversations alike. She looked at the house Walters had built for her, at the gardens she had restored with her own hands, at the town that had become her home, at Margaret, who was arguing cheerfully about whether the retreat center needed a commercial kitchen or could get by with residential appliances. Eleanor smiled, not the practiced, gracious, carefully calibrated smile she had worn for 40 years. A real one. the kind that reaches the eyes and changes the whole face and cannot be manufactured by anyone who is not genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy. She picked up her pen and began to write. She was 68 years old, and she was just getting started.